Welcome back to the second lecture in our series and the first to talk about the Bhagavad Gita, the great Indian epic on the nature of choice, on the nature of duty, and on our place in the universe. We're going to begin today with a bit of background on the Bhagavad Gita by talking about the story of the Mahabharata, the great epic in the context of which the Bhagavad Gita occurs. The term Mahabharata means the great epic of India. Bharat is the Indian name for India, the Sanskrit and the Hindi name. Mahabharata, the great epic of India. The Bhagavad Gita is one section of the Mahabharata, so we'll begin by talking about the big story so that we can understand the context of the small story. And that will give us the context for the battlefield that we're going to enter and the tremendous choice that our great hero Arjuna will face, the choice that will structure the text itself. After discussing the context of Arjuna's choice, we're going to pay attention to the poignancy of the choice, why the choice is so important, why the choice is so much like choices that we make every day in our daily lives. What we're going to see is that the Gita is giving us a very detailed and deep anatomy of the nature of deep existential choices. And the fact that we are not always conscious that we're not making deep existential choices doesn't mean that we're not making them. Later on in this course, for instance, when we read Tolstoy's great book, The Death of Ivan Elytz, we're going to see that the failure to understand the fact that we've been making choices all our lives can in fact be one of the most devastating realizations to which we can come. But why are we reading the Bhagavad Gita? Well, as I said, the Bhagavad Gita is part of the great epic, the Mahabharata. Mahabharata itself wasn't composed by a single author or at a single time. It was composed over about an 800-year period, beginning in about 400 before the Common Era and reaching its present form in about 400 after the Common Era. And it's a sprawling, many-volume epic. The Gita itself is a relatively small part of that big story, and we believe that it was composed at around the year 100 of the Common Era, more or less, and reached stabilization soon after that. The Bhagavad Gita is an extraordinarily important text in Indian life and in Hindu moral life. Many people call it the Hindu Bible. That's not strictly true, but it does function in Hindu culture in many of the ways that the Bible functions in our culture. It's a text that religious Hindus will frequently quote from, a text that is regularly studied, a text to which people turn for moral and spiritual guidance, a text that is sort of found prominently in Hindu temples and very much beloved in India. So it's a very, very important text in an Indian cultural context. Moreover, the Bhagavad Gita was also the central resource for the great leader Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi in developing his own moral theory, his account of satyagraha, of insistence on the truth, and of nonviolent resistance to injustice. Now, Gandhi, of course, was in turn deeply influential on the great American leader, Martin Luther King. And so, even though we don't find King citing the Bhagavad Gita, King, through Gandhi, is imbibing a lot of the insights of the Bhagavad Gita, and it can be very instructive to read King's work in the context of this text. Martin Luther King was not the first American to have been taken by the Bhagavad Gita. It was also read very closely by American transcendentalists, such as Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. They took it as providing the essence of Hindu thought, and for a long time in American letters, Hinduism was equated with the Bhagavad Gita because of its influence on the transcendentalists. So even though this is a very old text, and in some ways is going to seem very unfamiliar, it's a text that has seeped into our own cultural context, and we're going to see a lot of ideas that are going to strike you as very familiar, even though they're raised in unfamiliar contexts. The other thing about the Bhagavad Gita that's worth emphasizing before we begin is, as I mentioned in our last lecture, it's a verse epic. And so part of what we're going to be doing is learning how to read a verse epic, how to read these verses as more than just poetry, but as articulating philosophical insights and philosophical ideas. It has a narrative voice, it's a narrative verse, and so we have a kind of fictional a fictional narrator who's reciting this to a fictional audience. And we'll talk about that in a little while. The text itself has its entire tone set by an opening question, as we will see, the question about what happened on this great battlefield that we'll be visiting very soon. Chapter 1 poses that question. And the question is posed to this great seer, Sanjaya, who is the narrator of most of the text. He's going to set the scene, and in chapter 1, he's going to take us to this epic battlefield, a battlefield that is probably mythological, in a battle that's probably mythological, but which is deeply metaphorical, and tell us about the forces that are arrayed and the dismay of our hero, Arjuna. Now, it's going to turn out that Arjuna, great general though he is, and poised on the brink of this great battle, is reluctant to fight. Fortunately, however, for him, as we're going to see, it's going to turn out that his charioteer is the deity, Krishna, the embodiment of the Godhead in Hindu theology, and so he's a general with a god for a charioteer. And it's Krishna's instruction to Arjuna that constitutes the bulk of the text itself. In the 2nd through the 5th chapter, Krishna explains to Arjuna the nature of discipline, the nature of yoga, as we call it in Sanskrit. In chapters 6 through 7, Krishna talks about the relationship between yoga and understanding or judgment. In the 8th through the 11th chapters, Krishna introduces the notion of the divinity and our relationship to the divine aspect of the universe. And this leads very naturally in 12 and 13 to a discussion of the nature of devotion and the importance of devotion in our lives. Chapter 14 through 16 address and analyze the nature of the world we live in and the nature of personality. And the final 2 chapters, 17 and 18, address the nature of faith in the context of all of this. That's an outline of the text. But now let's look at the bigger context. Let's talk about the story of the Mahabharata, the great epic of the founding of India, which, as I say, we should treat as a kind of mythological text, but also a text rich in metaphor. So the Mahabharata begins, this part of the Mahabharata, we're going to be concerned with a struggle for the ancient kingdom called Kurukshetra in North India. Now, Kurukshetra is probably a legendary kingdom. We have no real evidence that it ever existed. Maybe it existed, or maybe something like it existed, but it's at least a wonderfully metaphorical battlefield. So we've got a struggle for a kingdom. The struggle is between 2 sets of cousins. We have the 5 sons of Pandu versus the 100 sons of Dhritarashtra. But both Pandu and Dhritarashtra are sons of the great legendary king Bharata, who in Indian mythic history is thought of as the founder of India. So we've got Bharata up here as the founder of India, and he's got these 2 sons, Pandu and Dhritarashtra. Now, we get the story of a weirdly dysfunctional family. Dhritarashtra is the older of the 2 sons, and so you would think that he would inherit the kingdom from Bharata. But unfortunately, Dhritarashtra was blind. And so because of his disability, his younger brother Pandu becomes the king. However, it turns out that Pandu has a curse placed upon him. And the curse requires Pandu to be celibate on pain of death. And this is a problem because then Pandu can't produce any heirs to the throne. So he does the obvious thing. He retreats to the forest, becoming a forest ascetic, leaving his older brother, the blind Dhritarashtra, as his regent. Now things get a little bit weird, and I don't want to try to go into the biology of all of this, but somehow in the forest, 5 different gods help the celibate Pandu father 5 sons. And these 5 sons are called the Pandavas, the 5 sons of Pandu. Now, being royal princes, the Pandavas are raised in the court. And being raised in the court, they're given a spiritual teacher. His name is Bhimsa. He's going to figure later on. And they're given a martial arts teacher, Drona. And it turns out that these 5 are just better at everything than their 100 cousins, the sons of Dhritarashtra. They're better at archery. They're better at poetry. They're better at everything you mentioned. They just top the class. The oldest one of these, Yudhishthira, should be the heir to the throne. because of course his father was the oldest son of Bharata. But Duryodhana, the oldest cousin, who's been kind of in charge of things, wants to rule. So you've got the Pandavas on one side and you've got these 100 sons on the other side, and they need to decide who gets to run the kingdom. And so they do what you would probably do in your family to make a decision like this. They roll the dice. Now the stakes go like this. The loser has got to go into exile for 13 years while the winner rules the kingdom, and after 13 years you get to come back and have the kingdom. So the Pandavas, it turns out, lose the roll of the dice, and they have to go and live for 13 years in exile in the forest. As our story begins, the Pandavas are returning from their 13 years of exile, and they'd like the kingdom. On the other hand, as you can probably guess, Duryodhana, who's been running the kingdom for the last 13 years, kind of likes this gig, and he would like to stay king. And so they have to fight. Now, the battle forms the context of the Bhagavad Gita. That's what it's about. And this battle, whether historical or mythical, or as I'd like to understand it, metaphorical, raises very deep questions that are going to be important to us in our investigation of the meaning of life. Questions about honor, questions about family duty, questions about ritual duty, which is very important in the Indian context, and as we will see, has its echo in our own kind of context. Personal destiny, good and evil, and even the order of the universe. This is a really important battle in all of these respects. The battlefield is Kurukshetra, this mythical place. And Vyas, who is the author of the Mahabharata in Indian legend, allows in this context Dhritarashtra, the father of the 100 cousins who are ruling the kingdom now, to hear a blow-by-blow account from Sanjaya. Sanjaya is a seer, a kind of prophet who can mystically see what's happening on the battlefield. Mythically, the text is giving us a literal battlefield with our real armies and a huge battle about to take place whose stakes are who's going to rule the kingdom. So that's the mythical situation. But allegorically, what the Bhagavad Gita presents us is a battle between convention and higher duty, a battle between order and chaos, a battle between individual desire and understanding one's own place in the universe in the broad picture. The Bhagavad Gita invites us to an inquiry through this epic into the question, how can you lead a life detached from your narrow egoistic desires? How can you put those aside and lead a life that's got meaning beyond that? Remember when we talked about the meaning of life? We said meaning always involves going beyond the particular to something outside. And in this case, we're worried about going beyond one's own narrow viewpoint. My plan for this particular lecture is that we're going to get as far as understanding that important question. What is it to act in this more meaningful way? But the other thing to see is that the Gita is also, despite its epic scale, a deeply personal text. It's the story of personal agony in the context of hard choices. It's the story of one man, Arjuna, who has got legitimately very difficult choices with no clear right answer and high stakes. And so it is really about our own personal relationship to the world in which we live. Because as far as the Gita is concerned, the central insight we want to draw from this text is that we live a life in which we are constantly making poignant, important choices, existential choices. And if we don't understand how to make those choices, there's no way of making meaning out of that life. So now what I would like to do is take you to the beginning of the text and to read the opening verses to set the scene for the battle. Dhritarashtra says, Sanjaya, remember Sanjaya is the seer. He says, Sanjaya, tell me what my sons and the sons of Pandu did when they met, wanting to do battle on the field of Kuru, on the field of sacred duty. Now let's pause on that phrase for a moment. That last phrase, on the field of sacred duty. He could have just said, on the battlefield, on the field of Kurukshetra, but he didn't. He called it the field of sacred duty. And this really indicates the metaphor with which we're working. Because this isn't meant to be a kind of historical war story like D-Day or something like that. It's meant to be a story that is about a story that illuminates the way in which we work out our duty. And so when we think about the field of sacred duty, you and I have never been to Kurukshetra and probably never will be to Kurukshetra. But the point that the Gita is making in this opening verse is that every one of us does battle every day on the field of sacred duty. That is, the domain in which we need to make important moral choices in circumstances of uncertainty where we really have to look into ourselves to see what we're doing. Now, in the next few verses, Sanjaya basically begins the story of the battle. He says, "Well, your son Duryodhana said to his teacher Drona, there's a huge army in front of us. The Pandavas have got a big army." But your son had confidence because he'd said, "I've got a pretty big army too. There's lots of heroes fighting for me, lots of great generals, and moreover, our army's bigger than their army." Your son was confident. He thought you were going to win. And then the battle really gets ready to start. Sanjaya says that lots of conch horns begin to sound from the armies. There's a clashing of spears on shields. There are trumpets blaring. People are yelling. The battle is about to get going. This is where we're going to get the context for the main part of the text. Because at this moment, Arjuna, one of the great generals of the Pandavas, asks his charioteer, who, by the way, just happens, as I mentioned earlier, to be the god Krishna. This is a very, very convenient charioteer to have, and I advise that if you ever need a charioteer, you get a deity to drive your chariot. Asks Krishna to drive his chariot out to the middle of the battlefield and to stop in between the armies so that he can survey the field. This is the moment of choice that constitutes the rest of the text. This is the frame. Arjuna is our hero. He's the representative of humanity. He is you. He is me. And he stops with God in the middle of this conflict just before he makes his crucial choice about what to do with his life to consider his options. And so now what I want to do is to read the discussion of this crucial choice with you. It's absolutely beautiful poetry. I hope you're going to enjoy it. Arjuna saw them standing there, fathers, grandfathers, teachers, uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, and friends. He surveyed his elders and companions in both armies, all his kinsmen assembled together. Now pause on this for a moment. Look at what's happening. As I said, this is a battle between family members. We've got two sets of cousins opposing each other. We've got uncles and grandfathers on each side. And Arjuna is recognizing that if he fights, if he prosecutes the battle that he's come to fight, he's going to be slaying his own kinsmen. He'll be attacking his own family. And that's something that none of us would ever wish to do, and Arjuna surely does not. Here's what he says next. The text reads, "Dejected, filled with strange pity, he said this, 'Krishna, I see my kinsmen gathered here, wanting war. My limbs sink, my mouth is parched, my body trembles. The hair bristles on my flesh. The magic bow slips from my hand. My skin burns. I can't stand still. My mind reels. I see omens of chaos, Krishna. I see no good in killing my kinsmen in battle.'" What is Arjuna saying here? He's telling us that this idea of launching a battle against his own family seems to him to be an absolutely terrible thing to do. On the one hand, as a soldier, that's his duty. That's what he's come to do. On the other hand, as a human being, how can he wage war against those he loves? I want to read what Arjuna now says to Krishna again. He says, "How can we ignore the wisdom of turning away from this evil when we see the sin of family destruction, Krishna? When the family is ruined, the timeless laws of family duty perish, and when duty is lost, chaos overwhelms the family." Saying this in this time of war, Arjuna slumped in the chariot, laid down his bow and arrows, his mind tormented with grief. I'd like you to notice here that what the Gita is setting up is a conflict between, in this case, caste duty and family duty. In the Hindu classical tradition, we have these four principal castes: the Brahmin or priestly caste, the Kshatriya or warrior caste, the Vaishya or merchant caste, and the Shudra or servant caste. And Arjuna, as a member of the Kshatriya class, has a duty to fight. He's a soldier. Now, all of this might seem completely irrelevant to us. We don't live in a caste system. But nonetheless, note that we often have duties peculiar to our stations in life or to our professions. A doctor may have a duty to heal his patients, to maintain confidentiality, and so forth. A lawyer to defend his client, even if he may not agree with the cause. A teacher to teach his students, even if he may not like them very much. We often have duties that attend to us in virtue of our station in life. These are the kinds of duties that structure a great deal of our life. This is just like caste duty. The name for this in Sanskrit is svadharma, one's own duty. And the idea that the Gita is pushing here is that our own svadharma, our own personal duty, may sometimes conflict with larger duties, larger principles, and this is what generates the really hard existential choices in our lives. So this is about personal duty, it's about svadharma, and in this case, it looks like the right thing to do is to forego the fight. It looks like that should be the right thing to do. And let's see Arjuna worried about that. We read from the text, Arjuna sat dejected, filled with pity, his sad eyes blurred by tears, and Krishna gave him counsel. Now, pause for a moment here. This is a wonderful moment to think about. Arjuna has understood that he's being asked to do something pretty terrible, something that he believes is deeply immoral, to wage war against his own family in order to win a kingdom. And he knows he's got God as his charioteer. So he asks him, what should I do? The rest of the Bhagavad Gita is about what Krishna tells him. And you would expect that what God will tell him is, forget all this violence, forget this kingdom, don't fight, make peace. But here's what Krishna says in fact. Krishna writes, why this cowardice in time of crisis, Arjuna? The coward is ignoble, shameful, foreign to the ways of heaven. Don't yield to impotence, it's unnatural in you. Banish this petty weakness from your heart. Rise to the fight, Arjuna. How surprising is that? You ask God whether you should fight or make peace, and God says, kill your kinsman. There's a big surprise here. And so we're going to have to explore exactly why that happens. Arjuna himself is puzzled by it, and he asks, Krishna, how can I fight against Bhimsa and Drona with arrows when they deserve my worship? It's better in this world to beg for scraps of food than to eat meals smeared with the blood of elders I killed. Let's reread that verse. It's so beautiful. It is better in this world to beg for scraps of food than to eat meals smeared with the blood of elders I killed. So Arjuna is emphasizing here that if he fights, then no matter what he gains, even if it's a whole kingdom, he gains it at the price of having committed this terrible sin of killing his relatives, of doing something one should never do. He's torn deeply between his duty as a warrior and his duty to family, his duty to his brothers and his duty to his elders, between the justice of his cause, because his cause is just, and the imperative to make peace. Arjuna's duty as a warrior is to fight. His cause is just, but in this case, that's not enough, because on the other side are his relatives, and he has a duty not to harm them just as he has a duty to fight for his own side. And moreover, their cause is just too. This is a kingdom to which each side has a legitimate claim, and that is so important for the Bhagavad Gita. Our difficult decisions in life aren't decisions between what's obviously right and what's obviously wrong. Our difficult decisions emerge when there are good reasons to do each of two things, where those two things are alternatives, or good reasons to forbear from doing each of those two things when those things are alternatives. That's Arjuna's problem. It's a real decision, not an easy decision. And Arjuna doesn't want the kingdom. He notices that greed doesn't justify violence. He doesn't want to, as he put it, to eat the food smeared with blood. So Arjuna has to ask himself, is he motivated by greed? Or is he motivated by the quest for justice? Is he motivated by honor? Or is he motivated by fear of the battle or fear of doing this terrible thing? Is Arjuna motivated by concern for the immediate context, for his own actions? Or is he motivated by concern for what's universally right? Most of our important choices, our existential choices, are just like that. They're genuine conflicts, not apparent ones. They're conflicts between important values. And the fact is that even if we don't notice that our choices involve conflicts like that, they do. And to fail to take those conflicts seriously is just to act in bad faith. That's something Arjun is not doing. He takes the conflict seriously. That's why he's a model for us. Arjuna's despondency, Arjuna's terror at this moment, isn't fear of battle. It's the unwillingness to do what's wrong. It's the unwillingness to commit sin. That's a noble sort of terror. But the problem, of course, is, and what makes the thing so poignant, is that paralysis, even though it feels noble, might arise from taking too narrow and too personal a view. Now, Arjuna's choice, as I said, might appear outsized and mythic. Very few of us fight battles for kingdoms. Very few of us have deities for charioteers. But really, as I said, it's a very mundane choice. The essential parts are a conflict of duties, an uncertainty about what's right, a really complicated social situation,